whispers through time, secrets of desire, wisdom, and healing step gently into a world where history isn't written in books, but whispered through candlelit chambers, temple walls, and quiet hearts. This story carries you through the veiled emotions and hidden truths of forgotten souls across centuries. In a medieval village where love and desire were policed by prayer, young Ilara questions everything she was taught about purity and pleasure. Far away, in a crumbling monastery, Thomas discovers the calm power of Stoic thought to heal wounds that time alone cannot. Beneath Roman columns, where steam curls in marble bathhouses, the healer Lintus tends both the body and the aching loneliness of Rome's elite. In golden Egypt, where magic and medicine entwined like lovers, Priestess Nefrit uses chants, herbs, and divine intuition to guide life and death. Each tale offers more than history. It breathes warmth into ancient skin, reviving voices long silenced. You'll feel the weight of a linen veil in a church, the cool stone of a Roman basin, the scent of desert herbs crushed beneath moonlight. These are stories of women and men caught between what they must do and what they long to feel. They question rules, break silences, and carve out tender spaces in a world that rarely allowed softness. This is not history as you know, it is history as it felt, a lullaby of truths, a murmur of secrets, a meditation across time. Close your eyes, and let each chapter draw you deeper into forgotten hearts, where love defied law, healing was holy, and even silence had a name. Part 1, Shadows of Desire. In the medieval world, in the quiet village of Everwood, nestled within rolling hills and ancient woods of 13th century Europe, the rhythm of life beat in accordance with the church bells, the seasons, and whispered customs passed down from grandmothers to granddaughters. The cobblestone paths bore the weight of centuries of footsteps, and the air always held a faint scent of smoke, bread, and damp moss. In this village lived a girl named Ilara, 17 years of age, on the verge of marriage to a man twice her age whom she barely knew. The wedding had been arranged by her family, a union of land and loyalty rather than love, and the entire village buzzed with anticipation. But Ilara's mind was not consumed by linen and feast arrangements like the others. It swam in questions about the body, the soul, and the unspoken acts between husband and wife that no one ever explained aloud. Raised within the church's teachings, she had learned of chastity, of sin, of obedience, and of her duty to bear children, but her instincts whispered there was more than duty, more than silence. The evening before her wedding, the sky turned purple behind the pine trees. Ilara slipped away from her family's cottage and walked toward the edge of the woods, where an old healer named Miriam lived in solitude. Miriam was unlike anyone Ilara had ever known, wrinkled with wisdom, her eyes carrying the storms of forgotten truths. In a world ruled by monks and lords, Miriam moved with freedom, trusted by the villagers for her herbal remedies, but feared for her knowledge. Miriam welcomed Ilara with a gentle nod and placed a hand over her heart, as if to say, "Speak freely," and so Ilara did. She confessed her fears, not of the man, but of the unknowns of marriage, the vague warnings, and the tightly held secrets about what happened after the vows. Miriam brewed a tea of lavender and yarrow, and, by the firelight, began to tell her stories. She spoke of how love and touch had been practiced long before the church's control, when bodies were still seen as sacred and desire was not demonized. She told Ilara that the idea of the chastity belt was more myth than reality, an invention of fear and later of entertainment, not of medieval practice. She shared how women, even in Ilara's time, found quiet ways to learn, midwives passing down advice in whispers, older sisters teaching younger ones in riddles. Miriam explained that, though the church taught sex as a tool for procreation, many found ways to reclaim it for pleasure, for connection. There were brothels in larger cities, she said, regulated and taxed, sometimes protected, where women worked in complex positions not entirely free, but not entirely imprisoned either. Ilara listened, wide-eyed, sipping her tea as her world slowly expanded. She learned of herbal contraception, pennyroyal, wild carrot, and other plants women used to avoid pregnancy in secret. Miriam described how virginity, prized so highly in public, was sometimes performed rather than real, with tricks of blood and ceremony. Consent was rarely spoken of in legal terms, but in the language of eyes, silence, resistance, and surrender, people found ways to protect and assert themselves. There were dangers, yes, punishments for women accused of promiscuity, cruel gossip, and sometimes worse. But there were also friendships, sisterhoods, and quiet rebellions. Ilara left that night changed, not defiant, not wild, but aware that she was stepping into a tradition older than any wedding band. A story written on flesh and carried in size between candlelit sheets. The next day, as the village chapel filled with smoke from incense and muttered Latin prayers, Ilara stood beside Thomas Grayson, a tall man with a patient smile and eyes that gave nothing away. The priest spoke of unity and fruitfulness. The villagers watched with reverence, but Ilara's mind drifted to Miriam's words. Love can be found even in arranged unions, but only if you do not abandon yourself in the process. That night, after the feast of meats and mead, after the music and dancing, Ilara entered the marriage bed, not as a girl consumed by fear, but as a woman carrying knowledge. Thomas was gentle, if a bit awkward. He asked no questions but showed no aggression. It was not a tale of passion, nor of violence, just a people trying to navigate a ritual neither had truly been prepared for. In the days that followed, Ilara began her duties as wife of the Grayson household, managing servants, keeping accounts, tending to the garden. But in quiet moments, she returned to Miriam's hut, where she learned more not just of intimacy, but of life, cycles, and the power of female knowledge. Miriam taught her about moon cycles, about lust and longing, about the reality that medieval women were not passive victims of patriarchy, but often careful negotiators of their world. Ilara learned about love spells carved into bits of bone, secret affairs conducted behind barn walls, and coded messages and embroidery shared between lovers and friends. Some women loved men, others women, and some neither. All were forced to hide parts of themselves. The church preached abstinence outside marriage and condemned desire, but behind cloistered doors, even monks were not immune. Stories filtered through of affairs within abbeys, of noble women seducing priests, and of traveling bards who offered more than music. At times, Ilara would sit in Miriam's hut and imagine a world not ruled by shame. Meanwhile, far away in a stone monastery perched atop a cliff, another Thomas, the scribe, sat at a wooden desk, copying ancient texts. He was not the same Thomas as Ilara's husband, but a quiet soul who found refuge in philosophy, particularly in the words of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. He had no lover, no family, only his thoughts and the dusty volumes that passed through his hands. And yet, he too felt longing not for flesh, but for understanding. Stoicism, he believed, was the answer. In a world full of suffering, Stoics taught that peace came not from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote in his margins. But even in his sanctuary, Thomas could not escape the contradictions. He copied sermons condemning lust in the morning, and translated Stoic lines about physical love in the evening. The monks around him whispered of sin, but some betrayed their vows. One young monk, Brother Julian, confessed to Thomas his love, for another a love he dared not speak of in the open. Thomas said nothing, but in his silence was understanding. The monastery was not immune to desire. It simply buried it under robes and rituals. Back in Everwood, Ilara continued to learn. The seasons changed, and with it, her marriage. She found small pleasures: his smile when he returned from the fields, their shared meals, the feeling of her garden beneath her fingertips. They were not lovers in the way poems described, but companions, respectful, if not passionate. In the winter of that year, a traveler came to the village, a widow named Sabine, who had journeyed from the southern coast. She was unlike anyone the villagers had seen, bold, educated, and uninterested in appeasing local customs. Ilara and Sabine became fast friends. Sabine spoke openly of things Ilara only dared think about: the absurdity of purity culture, the danger of repression, the joy of physical touch. She had been married once, but after her husband's death, she never remarried. "Why should I," she said, "when I have already learned to love myself better than any man ever did?" Sabine's presence was a spark. With her came stories of women healers in Moorish Spain, of poets in Constantinople, of bathhouses where women bathed together and shared songs. Ilara began to write small, secret notes about her thoughts, her body, her hunger for a life that was more than survival. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. She even began helping Miriam in the care of pregnant women, learning about childbirth and the strength it demanded. She saw how women held each other in labor, how they whispered secrets about their husbands, how they cried from joy and grief in the same breath. At night, Ilara would lie beside Thomas, sometimes sleeping with his hand loosely wrapped around hers, sometimes facing the wall, lost in her own thoughts. One night, she asked him what he had been told about marriage, about sex. He looked at her with a sad smile. That it was duty, that it was my right, that it was yours to give. But no one told me how to make it kind. They began, slowly, to unlearn and relearn together. And somewhere between the frost and the thaw, between the silence and the laughter, something resembling love began to bloom. Not a fire, but a candle. Not overwhelming, but steady. Miriam died the following spring, her body buried under the roots of an elder tree. The village honored her, and Ilara wept at her grave, placing a sprig of rosemary in her cold hand. Sabine left soon after, off to another village, another place to live loudly. Ilara stayed, planting herbs in Miriam's garden, welcoming women into her home, sharing the knowledge passed to her. She became known not just as Thomas Grayson's wife, but as a woman of wisdom, kindness, and quiet rebellion, and thus, in a world of priests and punishments, of arranged vows and whispered desire, Ilara became a bridge between the old world and the new, between silence and story, between shame and sacredness. And in doing so, she joined a lineage older than the church, wider than the village, and deeper than the rules written by frightened men. Her story was just one of many, but it was enough. Part 2. The Roman rituals of body and bond. Long before the bells of Everwood echoed through forests and valleys, before monks scribbled Latin into parchment and sermons ruled desire, there was Rome, vast, vibrant, and pulsing with the rhythm of marble footsteps and murmured ambition. The Eternal City, as it was called even then, was more than just stone and empire. It was a theater of the senses, where body and bond, duty and indulgence danced in tandem beneath the shadows of aqueducts and arches. In a district not far from the bustling forum lived a woman named Livia di Ichima, born to a minor senatorial family but reared with a hunger for knowledge the empire rarely allowed women to feed. Her father, a stern man with a fondness for Cicero, kept scrolls in the atrium, and though he scolded her when she reached for them, she learned to read in secret from a slave-turned-tutor named Gaius, a Greek who had once lectured on rhetoric, before being captured during a campaign. It was Gaius who first introduced Livia to Stoicism, not with formal lessons but with quiet philosophy beneath olive trees, quoting Epictetus, between sips of watered wine. Freedom, he told her, is not a gift of Rome, but a state of the soul. These words rooted themselves in her, even as she came of age in a world of expectation. At 14, Livia was married to Publius Vero, a man 20 years her senior, a respected tribune with gray in his beard and discipline in his bones. He treated her well, as one might a delicate statue, always courteous, but never curious. Their union was political, strategic, and the bed they shared was more a duty than a desire. Yet Livia, with her growing mind and restless heart, found refuge not in her husband's arms, but in the public baths of Rome. These baths were more than pools of water, they were sanctuaries of flesh and freedom. From dawn until dusk, they teemed with life. Senators discussing policy in the tepidarium, merchants trading whispers in the calidarium, young lovers laughing in the frigidarium. The air was thick with heat and eucalyptus, the marble walls echoing with voices that had no place in temples. Here, Livia learned a new language, not Latin, but the tongue of gesture, of glance, of touch. The baths were a rare equalizer. While class still dictated the layout, wealthier patrons entered cleaner wings. Slaves tended to their masters, and women bathed separately from men. There was something about nudity that leveled pride. Livia watched as wrinkled dowagers shared benches with smooth-shouldered courtesans, as noblewomen whispered secrets into the ears of freedwomen, as mothers taught daughters the art of bodily grace. The act of bathing was a ritual first, a slow immersion in warm waters, then a sharper plunge into the cold, followed by oiling the skin and scraping it clean with curved digils. Livia loved the sound of it, the splash, the hum, the laughter, the scrape. Their bodies were not hidden or shamed, but honored for what they endured. Childbirth, toil, age, pleasure. Livia met a woman there named Aurelia, whose family ran a chain of dye workshops along the Tiber. Tall and bronze-skinned, Aurelia moved like water fluid, unhurried, confident. She was not noble, not trained in rhetoric, but she knew the world. She spoke of perfume traders from Egypt, of philosophers who wandered marketplaces speaking in riddles, of women who lived with women beyond the reach of Roman law. Livia was fascinated. They began to meet regularly, soaking in silence or exchanging soft conversation about life, marriage, and the limitations of both. With Aurelia, Livia discovered the first blush of what it meant to be seen not as a wife, a Roman, or a daughter, but simply as herself. They did not touch at first. Not beyond the brushing of fingers, while passing a jar of scented oil, but the energy between them was unmistakable. It was Aurelia who first spoke the truth aloud. They teach us to serve, to obey, to reproduce, but what of joy, Livia? What of our own hungers? Livia had no answer, only the pounding of her heart and the heat of the calidarium in her blood. In her villa, she began to see her world differently. The mosaics that lined the walls depicted gods and goddesses in states of undress, an ecstasy Bacchus in a drunken embrace, Venus emerging from the sea, Apollo with his lyre and lovers. Desire was not hidden in Romette, was celebrated in art, in poetry, in architecture, yet even so, true emotional freedom was rare, and Livia now longed for both. She began writing in secret journals, hidden in hollow scroll, cases filling pages with thoughts on stoicism, on bodily autonomy, on the tension between duty and delight. She often quoted Seneca, who said, "No man is free who is a slave to his body," and mused whether that applied to women, too. Could one serve Rome yet free themselves from its expectations? Could a woman love her husband and also herself? Aurelia answered not with philosophy but with presence. One evening, during a festival, Livia slipped away from her household and met Aurelia beneath the orange trees lining the edge of the Palatine Hill. The air was heady with incense and wine. Fire dancers lit up the night with gold. They walked in silence until, in a shaded alcove, Aurelia reached for her, cradling her cheek with a tenderness Livia had never known. There was no rush, no conquest, no script. Their kiss was slow, exploratory, as though learning each other's language syllable by syllable. That night, they did not speak much. The stones held their warmth as they lay beside each other, the stars above, vast and silent. Livia thought of the baths, the mosaics, the philosophers, and how none of them could fully capture this. But Rome was not a city of permanence. Months passed, and Aurelia's father arranged her marriage to a wealthy merchant in Gaul. She left with a single word, live, and a pressed flower in Livia's hand. The loss stung, but it did not destroy. Livia returned to her life with a quiet resolve. She continued her baths, her readings, her writings. She bore 2 children with Publius dutifully safely, but she never forgot Aurelia, nor the lessons she left behind. In her journal, she wrote, "My body belongs to Rome, but my mind is my own empire." In time, her husband came to respect her quiet strength. He never asked questions about her afternoons. He admired her intellect and gave her space, and though their love was never fiery, it was real in its own way, shared life, a mutual trust. When their son came of age, Livia ensured he studied under Stoic tutors, hoping he might become a man who honored his own soul and the souls of others. She told her daughter stories not of duty, but of choices, and though she never said Aurelia, named the memory of her lived in every sentence. Rome changed, as all things do. Emperors rose and fell. Laws shifted. The baths, once places of conversation and community, grew more opulent and political. But for those who remembered, like Livia, they remained sacred, not for the marble, but for the moments, for the freedom to be seen. As age settled into her bones, Livia became something of a matriarch, respected, not feared. Young women sought her advice. Slaves whispered about her kindness. Philosophers mentioned her name in debates, uncertain if she was myth or memory. She outlived Publius, raised her children, and when her daughter married, she gave her a carved wooden box with a scroll inside. On it, a single phrase from Gaius: "Freedom is not a gift of Rome, but a state of the soul." Livia died at 74, her journals stored in clay jars behind her mosaic wall. They were never discovered, but their spirit survived in daughters and granddaughters, in stories passed between bathhouse walls, in women who dared to walk slowly and speak softly but think deeply. And so, the rituals of Rome, the scraping of oil, the plunge into cold, the whispers and steam became not just acts of cleansing, but of remembering, of reclaiming, of returning to the self. Even as empires crumbled and churches rose, even as shame replaced sculpture, somewhere in the memory of stone and steam, the voice of Livia still lingered, reminding all who cared to listen that the body is not shameful, the soul is not secondary, and that between ritual and reason lies the tender space where freedom is born. Part 3. Cloisters and Secrets. The hidden world of medieval women. By the time Rome's mighty columns had crumbled into memory and its philosophies etched into the tomes of monks, Europe had entered an age of whispered prayers and cloistered women, a time when the divine was dressed in Latin, and silence was often mistaken for virtue. In a high stone abbey nestled within the misty hills of what was once the Frankish Empire, Sister Isidora of St. Lout moved like a shadow, her habits always clean, her voice rarely used. The abbey was a fortress of order and rules, but within its walls lived dozens of women from noble bloodlines, daughters, offered to God in exchange for family prestige or divine favor. Isidora had arrived at 13, trembling and tear-stained, barely understanding why her father, a count with a falconer's pride and a heart of ice, had chosen God over a marriage for her. The prioress had greeted her with lavender oil and a cold gaze, and the stone walls had become her new world, her cell a cloister within a cloister. At first, the rhythm of monastic life nearly drowned her. Bells punctuated every hour, matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline at night. She scrubbed floors, copied manuscripts, tended gardens, and sang psalms, her voice joining the chorus of angelic sound rising into candle-scented air. Yet beneath the veil of piety and repetition, life in the abbey was not merely devotional, it was deeply, sometimes painfully, human. There were tears in the dormitories after lights out, when young women missed their homes or feared God's wrath. There were secret smiles exchanged across the scriptorium during long hours of copying text. There were stories passed from mouth to mouth in hushed tones of saints with bleeding feet, of nuns who bore stigmata, and of others who, some whispered, bore children in secret. Isadora, who had once dreamed of becoming a healer, like her grandmother, found herself drawn not to the altar, but to the infirmary, a small stone chamber filled with herbs, oils, and relics of healing knowledge older than the church itself. There she met Sister Agnes, a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a softer heart, who saw in Isadora not a vessel of obedience, but a mind eager to learn. Under Agnes's careful guidance, Isadora learned the properties of rue and comfrey, the mysteries of mugwort and yarrow. She learned to treat fevers with vinegar-soaked cloths, and ease childbirth with warm poultices and whispered prayers. More importantly, Agnes taught her to listen to the rhythms of a body, to the emotional weeping that accompanied sickness, to the pain the church often had no answer for. But medicine was not their only shared passion. In the evenings, when candlelight flickered against the stone, Agnes would read to her from hidden texts, not the Psalms or the Gospels, but ancient writings from women, healers, mystics, and even pagan midwives. Not all knowledge, Agnes once whispered, wears a cross. One day, while foraging near the edge of the abbey grounds, Isadora found a small shrine half buried beneath moss and ivy. It bore the image of a woman with flowing hair and a serpent at her feet. She brought this discovery to Agnes, who quietly identified her as a forgotten goddess of healing, long outlawed but never truly erased. The old ways survive, Agnes said, her voice almost reverent. In gardens, in stories, in us. Their bond deepened over time, not romantic, but fiercely intimate, a kind of intellectual and emotional love, rarely acknowledged within the convent's walls. Agnes, who had taken her vows during a time of famine, carried deep knowledge not just of plants, but of survival. She told Isadora about the plague years, the bodies piled outside town gates, the monks who fled in fear, the women who remained behind and kept people alive with tinctures and soup. Faith can move mountains, she said once, as she rubbed garlic salve onto a sore, but garlic can stop an infection. As Isadora matured, she became known among the sisters, not for her piety, but for her gentleness and wisdom. Even the prioress, once cold, began to send her troubled novices. One girl, young Elodie, had been found crying blood, a condition Isadora correctly diagnosed as a burst vessel, not a miracle. Another, Sister Clemens, confessed to Isadora that she loved another woman in the abbey. Rather than scold, Isadora listened and reminded her that many saints had experienced deep same-sex friendships that defied the understanding of even their chroniclers. You are not sinning, she said, if your heart is full of love and your hands do no harm. But not all saw her compassion as a virtue. Brother Matherin, the abbey's confessor, had long distrusted Isadora. He considered women who knew too much a threat to divine order, and Isadora, with her calm eyes and herb-scented robes, unnerved him. He began preaching sermons about Eve's disobedience, about the dangers of witchcraft, and about how even nuns must not overstep their role. When one sister died during childbirth, a secret pregnancy hidden beneath loose habits, the brother blamed Isadora's pagan meddling. Though no proof could be found, Isadora was forbidden from treating others, without the prioress's direct permission. Agnes grew frail that winter, her lungs plagued by what she called the damp. Isadora tried everything: mustard poultices, steam, even imported cinnamon, but the illness took her one icy dawn. Isadora was at her side, holding her hand. Before she passed, Agnes pressed something into her palm, a folded page of a grimoire, old and soft with use, filled with herbal diagrams and notes. "Keep learning," she whispered, "and keep others safe." Her death shattered Isadora in ways she could not speak. For weeks she wandered the abbey like a ghost, attending services with eyes dulled by grief. But slowly, she began to work again, first in the garden, then in the infirmary. She taught others, as Agnes had taught her, passing knowledge not just as instruction but as empowerment. She began compiling her own book, not of spells or chants, but of remedies, testimonies, and observations, testament to the healing power of care. And she began to write letters, carefully coded, addressed to other women in other abbeys, hidden within trade deliveries or stitched into linens. She built a network, a secret sisterhood of healers, thinkers, and quiet rebels. They shared recipes, stories, and warnings. "We are the second heart of the church," one letter read, not its voice, but its pulse. In time, Isadora's influence extended far beyond St. Loup. Pilgrims arrived at the abbey not for relics, but for her remedies. Rumors spread of a nun who could ease childbirth, calm madness, even soften the dying's pain. She refused all offers of patronage. She remained, always, a servant, but not just to God, to the truth, to compassion, to the memory of Agnes. When she died, at the age of 68, they buried her beneath the herb garden. Her book vanished, likely hidden by novices who feared its discovery. But her story lived on in the oral traditions of midwives and abbey, girls who remembered her touch, her voice, and her refusal to choose silence. In every convent that brewed lavender tea for anxiety, in every healer who whispered comfort instead of condemnation, the legacy of Sister Isadora endured. And so, in that age of darkened halls and locked doors, a light still burned, soft, steady, sacred, not from the altar, but from the heart of a woman who believed healing was the holiest work of all.